Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we will continue our journey through the book Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. We're on chapter 16. Chapter 16 is quite long, so I decided to split this chapter into two parts. I'll read part 1 this week and part 2 next week. Part 1 is called Flirting on a Flight. Here we go. Laziness was not the problem. I want to make that perfectly clear. Despite vast quantities of drugs and alcohol, and internal strife that led to a caravan of 5 separate buses when we went out on the road for the 1984 tour, Van Halen always managed to put in the work. Stoned and drunk and fighting like crazy, they recorded the best album of their careers, and then went on a tour that filled arenas and left fans breathless. Night after a remarkable night, I often watched these shows with a mix of awe and sadness. If not for the drugs, I thought, if not for the personality problems, these guys could run for the next 5 to 10 years. They could sell 50 million records and play football in soccer stadiums all over the world. They were that good. But I knew in my heart that it wasn't meant to last, that what people saw on the stage every night was only a sliver of the Van Halen reality. The real story was being told during the day, on those long and fractured bus rides, and deep into the morning hours, when the drugs and the drinking finally took their toll. We netted roughly $2 million per person in 1984, thanks in no part to this epic and practically cost-prohibitive tour. The goal was to put on the biggest and most entertaining show possible, which meant a fleet of nearly 20 trucks, in addition to the tricked-out tour buses, carrying hundreds of thousands of pounds and dollars worth of equipment. It's difficult to convey just how massive an enterprise this was, but here's an example. Our stage show featured a lighting rig with more than 2,000 lights. Even the biggest and most well-financed bands touring in those days settled for fewer than half that number. If you asked us, we'd have said that we were burning money to put on an unforgettable experience for fans. But in hindsight, it was almost like we subconsciously knew it would be a farewell tour, and we wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. A tour that stretched out over nearly 9 months began on January 18th in Jacksonville, Florida, before a sold-out crowd of more than 11,000 at the Jacksonville Coliseum. It was a nearly flawless show that ran almost 2 hours and betrayed none of the backstage tension that I knew to be a daily part of the Van Halen experience. Nor did it seem to be adversely affected by the lines of cocaine that Edward kept on a nearby amplifier to be snorted whenever needed, or by the beer and whiskey that Alex would guzzle throughout the evening. As musicians and entertainers, Van Halen appeared to be at the top of their game. What else mattered? There were nights early in the first leg of that tour, when we were rolling through the South, that I allowed myself to believe things would be all right, that my guys were so talented and unique, they could withstand pressures and influences that had been ripping apart bands since, well, as long as there had been bands. This was clearly not the case. Less than a month into the tour, I got my first taste of just how deeply Van Halen had fallen into the abyss of drug abuse when I got word from our bookkeeper that Edward had been quietly advancing himself large amounts of cash. Now, there was nothing illegal or even improper about this practice. We all took cash advances from time to time, but Edward, I was informed, had been withdrawing more than usual, with no explanation, not that one was required. I had been around the music business long enough to recognize this practice as a very large and vivid red flag. It often meant that the person taking the advance had either serious money problems or a serious drug problem, because obviously drugs are always purchased in cash. Edward did not have a money problem. What he did have was a personal drug dealer who would fly all over the world to meet Edward and supply him with his drugs of choice, primarily cocaine. I came to know this guy, not that we had a personal relationship, and I decided early in the tour simply to leave him alone. Crazy as it might sound, I figured that at least Edward had found a dealer he could trust, and who would meet him whenever and wherever he was needed. This guy's apparent 24/7 availability meant that Edward would never have to sneak out into the night and prowl the nastier neighborhoods of whatever city we happened to be passing through when his supply ran low. I disliked this guy the first time I met him, and as Edward deteriorated, my feelings intensified. But I did not try to chase him away, although that would have been easy enough to do. Did this make me an enabler? I didn't look at it that way. I was the manager of one of the biggest bands in the world, which meant in effect that I was running a large and lucrative business with a bunch of employees and others who depended on that business for their livelihoods. I did what I had to do in order to keep the machinery operating smoothly. Nothing I said or did was going to prevent Edward from abusing cocaine and vodka. He would have to reach that decision on his own, like any other addict. In the meantime, I was at least relieved that he had found a way to obtain the drug that was unlikely to result in his being either arrested or assaulted. So I made a decision to ignore his dealer, although there were times this guy really pushed his luck. I would see him outside a venue, for example, working the crowd, strolling casually among the rank and file, stopping occasionally to talk with concert goers, who would then disappear. Or sometimes I'd see a surreptitious handshake, a little hug, and then they'd go their separate ways. Any reasonable dealer would have realized that he had landed the gig of a lifetime working with Eddie, who, trust me, represented his fair share of business. Taking a chance in dealing in a parking lot, in addition to that business, is what really pissed me off. Especially in completely unknown cities with no real game plan. Somehow, though, what I can only assume is dumb luck, the guy never got busted, and he remained Edward's purveyor of the finest cocaine throughout that year. We were still on the southern swing when Edward came into my room one night, a half-empty bottle of vodka in his hand. He was, it seemed, primarily drunk, but the time had come to reverse the alcohol slide with some coke. Edward withdrew from his pocket a small vial containing maybe an ounce of white powder. My wife was on tour with us at the time, and while she knew of Edward's cocaine use, she did not know the full extent of it. Until that night, neither did I. "Hey guys," he said, slurring his words badly, "let me show you something." He held up the vial and smiled. "This is Peruvian flake." "Awesome." I looked at Jan. Then I looked at Edward. I shrugged. Cocaine in those days often had ridiculous nicknames, denoting its supposed strength or purity. The fact that it was late at night didn't matter. A point of contention on this tour, in fact, was Edward's penchant for working and writing, and drugging and drinking well into the morning hours. He and Valerie had separate but adjoining bedrooms for precisely this reason, so that his incessant noodling on the guitar wouldn't keep her up all night. Edward would just be going to bed when David would knock on the door and try to rouse everyone for a meeting, or for an impromptu session of roller skating or other forms of exercise that interested no one in the band other than David. Not that David was pure of mind or body, but he did work out like a beast. His pre-concert stretching routine, always performed in front of the rest of the band and their wives and girlfriends, would sometimes last an hour. It was all part of the Diamond Dave show. He liked to rise early most days, and his nagging, in combination with his continued role as a media magnet, got on everyone's nerves. Edward's most of all. I couldn't help but wonder how long Edward would continue to burn the candle at both ends before flaming out. That it never fully happened is something of a miracle. God knows he tried. Peruvian flake, huh? I said. Gee, that sounds great, Ed. I wasn't even trying to feign interest. I was being sarcastic, but Ed was too far gone to notice the difference. I was sick of hearing about cocaine, talking about cocaine, and witnessing its withering effect on my band. Then Ed did something he occasionally did when he was sufficiently up. Rather than pulling up a chair next to me, he curled up in my lap and put his head on my shoulder. Like a toddler, this full-grown man would lean into me and tell me how much he loved me. And sometimes, as on this night, he would encourage me to join his private party. Eddie poured out about 2 grams of coke and then made 4 lines with his bare hand. Now normally the proportioning of cocaine was done with a razor blade or a credit card, something to keep it precise, but Ed wasn't worried about wasting any of the product. There's a certain finesse that goes along with doing drugs, certain rituals that make it more of an experience than an action, for most people anyway. For Edward, it was done with all the grace of chugging a beer. Do you want me to get a bill? Jan offered. Nah, I don't need it. Then Jan and I watched in amazement as Eddie proceeded to put his head down on the dresser and snort about half of what he had just laid out. Well, that might work for you, Jan said, but I need a bill. I handed her 100. Does this work? It did indeed. Jan did maybe a fraction of a line, which promptly knocked her on her butt. How do you do all that? She asked. Eddie just laughed. It's no big deal, he said. Would you mind if I talked to Noel alone? The girls are playing poker. Why don't you go join them? Eddie, even coked out of his head and in the middle of climbing back into my lap, was always thoughtful and mild-mannered to Jan. I appreciated it. It was hard to imagine that Edward was capable of serious business talk at this point, but he had asked nicely, so Jan obliged. As Jan walked out of the room, she looked back at us. Edward, rocking on my lap like a baby, suckling vodka instead of milk, and I could see on her face a look of bewilderment. We had been together for a couple years, and she had seen and heard enough stories to get an idea of what life was like with Van Halen, but some things you just have to witness for yourself. As it happened, Edward had no desire to discuss business. He simply wanted to conduct a private test about David. Nothing arose from this conversation that I had not heard previously, so none of it came as much of a surprise. But there was a persistent negativity, almost hatred, in his tone that suggested a shift in their relationship. Edward had long chosen a non-confrontational path when dealing with David, but now he seemed more comfortable with the idea of standing up for himself. I admit that the image of a man curled up childlike on his manager's lap does not exactly support this notion, but again, if you knew Edward, you'd understand. He could be sensitive and sweet. He could also be churlish or childish. Depending on his mood and the level and type of intoxicants in his bloodstream, he was also capable of significant rage. By this time, one thing was clear. He had grown weary of playing second banana to Van Halen's loudmouth lead singer. Guy just drives me nuts, Edward said repeatedly and in many different forms that night. Yes, I know, Ed. You've made that clear. Later that night, when Jan returned, she told me all about her interesting night of cards. Jan liked Valerie and found her efforts to be treated as just one of the girls rather endearing and admirable. But for a Hollywood superstar, Valerie was somewhat naive. She was surprised to learn, for example, that most of the other women had been on the tour since the beginning, whereas Valerie had just flown in for a few nights. Her biggest complaint? "How come you only get laid on the first night?" she asked. "You'd think these guys would be so horny, they'd be dying to see us when we visit." This observation was met mostly with blank stares and suppressed laughter. None of the other women around the table could say what they were really thinking. "Well, maybe that's because Ed's a different girl every night when you're not here. What are you, dizzy or something?" But Valerie was nothing if not a spirited member of the tribe when she joined us. The ladies' card games were buoyed by alcohol and cocaine, and the TV star partook of both. Cocaine, she explained, helped suppress her appetite. "And Ed likes me skinny." Meanwhile, back in my room, between harangues about David, Edward kept telling me how much he loved me. Here's the thing about a drunk on cocaine. They tend to be a bit repetitive. And so Ed would repeat the usual complaints about David, then give me a big hug and smile, and tell me how grateful he was for my work on behalf of the band. This happened 2 or 3 times a week during the first few months of the tour, and after a while, I learned to tune it out. But there was one night relatively early on when he said something that piqued my interest. "I love you, Noel," he said, smiling drunkenly. "You know that, right?" "Sure, Edward, I love you too." He reached up and tousled my hair like a child. Indeed, sometimes, if he was sufficiently faced, Edward would even refer to me as Daddy. Jane would just look at him and laugh. He's at it again. But this time, he said something unexpected, and it gave me pause. "I don't care what Alex thinks," Edward slurred. "He can go himself. I always want you to be my manager." Now, given Edward's level of inebriation, I wasn't about to interrogate him as to the root of this observation, but considering the level of turmoil within the band and my ongoing status as a manager without a long-term contract, it did have a sobering effect. Not on Edward, obviously, but on me. I couldn't help but think, my time might be getting short here. But what could I do? I was far too busy to waste time obsessing about private conversations that might have taken place between the brothers Van Halen, especially if those conversations were fueled by drugs and alcohol, which they most certainly were. Interestingly, Jane had gotten rather close to Alex during the 1984 tour, which gave me a level of trust and comfort that might have been misleading. One thing I know for sure is that Alex's slide into addiction was every bit as disturbing as Edward's. While he might not have enjoyed cocaine quite as much as his brother, Alex drank like few people I have ever seen. Other drugs get most of the attention, but alcohol in excess will beat the out of you as thoroughly as heroin, cocaine, or anything else. It sure as did a number on Alex. It's always hard to pinpoint the exact moment when you recognize that someone has more than just a casual relationship with drugs or alcohol, or even when it becomes apparent that they have tumbled into the abyss of full-fledged addiction. As with going broke, it happens slowly, and then all at once. Remember, I hadn't spent that much time with the band during the months of writing and recording 1984. I had my suspicions about the extent of their deterioration based on phone calls and meetings, and an abundance of otherwise erratic behavior, but it wasn't until we got out on the road together that I was able to witness it firsthand. There was one moment relatively early in the tour, a month at the most, when Alex came into my room. It was 9:30 in the morning, which in itself was something of a surprise, as the boys of Van Halen were not generally morning people, David being the occasional outlier in this regard. Jane and I were not even up yet, but Alex's persistent knocking roused us from our sleep. I opened the door to discover Al fully dressed and full of energy. "Come on," he said, "let's go shopping." Now, as I said, Al and I sometimes would venture off together on sightseeing and shopping excursions, but not usually first thing in the morning. He had also become friendly with Jan, and sometimes when I wasn't so inclined, the two of them would go off together, while I stayed behind and took care of business. This would be one of those days. Al, I'm not really up for it, I said. He waved a hand dismissively and looked at my wife. Guess it's just you and me, Jan. What do you say? Jane was usually up for a shopping excursion, and she didn't mind Al's company, so she agreed. As she stood to excuse herself and get dressed, Al walked casually to the minibar and popped open the door. He rummaged around for a moment, withdrew 2 small bottles of vodka, and drank each one in a single gulp. Jan saw this as she walked away and gave me a backward glance of disbelief. What she did not see over the course of the next half hour was Al repeating this ritual with another half-dozen little bottles of booze, whiskey, gin, scotch, and a couple beers too. He must have put away the equivalent of 10 shots and 2 beers in a remarkably small window of time. By 10 o'clock in the morning, he was completely faced, and yet he seemed no more or less impaired than he had when he knocked on our hotel room door. Having grown up in an alcoholic family, I recognized this as a sign of maintenance. Al had reached the point where he was drunk most of his waking hours, and except when he drank to extraordinary excess, which he sometimes did, it was hard to differentiate between drunk and sober. Maybe he'd been up all night drinking. More likely, he had woken with a ferocious hangover and used my minibar to beat back the symptoms of withdrawal. I presume his minibar had already been drained. Regardless, this little show demonstrated to me that Al had escalated from heavy drinker to full-blown alcoholic. And now he was about to head out for a day of shopping with my wife. You know what, Al, I said, why don't you take a bodyguard with you, just to be on the safe side? He scoffed. Oh, come on, Noel. I don't need a bodyguard. I can take care of myself. I'm sure you can, but Jane is going to be with you too, and I'd feel better if you have some protection, okay? Grudgingly, Al agreed. He and Jan left the hotel in good spirits, and I went back to bed. In those days, a good decade before the advent of cell phones, we often carried walkie-talkies to facilitate communication. I had given one to Al before he left the hotel. An hour later, the walkie-talkie on my nightstand crackled to life. "Noel, you there?" He seemed agitated. "Yes, Al. Everything okay?" "No, we got a little problem." "Like what? You run out of alcohol?" Al did not laugh, and his silence provoked a knot in my stomach. With Van Halen, a little problem might indeed be minuscule, or it could be catastrophic. There was no way of knowing. Al, however, was not prone to hyperbole, and the fact that Jan was with him made me nervous. "Seriously, Al, what's the matter?" "We're in this shoe store," Al began. "Everything was fine, but then all of a sudden someone recognized me, and now there's a huge crowd outside the store. We can't get out, and your bodyguard can't clear the way. There's too many people." "Okay, just sit tight. Tell me exactly where you are, and I'll take care of it." I sent down a team of 8 security guards to clear a path out of the store and safely guide Al and Jan to freedom. A short time later, Jan returned to the hotel, alone. "Where's Al?" I asked. Jan shrugged. "I don't know. He said he wanted to go drinking, asked me to go along." "What did you say?" "I told him it was a little too early for me." That was life with Alex in 1984. I don't know what was worse, the fact that he wanted to go drinking at noon, or the fact that this supposedly indicated a starting point for the day of imbibing, when in fact he had already consumed more alcohol than most people could manage in an entire day. For Al, that mini-bar session was merely an appetizer. It didn't even count. Al got away with this behavior for a couple reasons. One, he was Edward's brother, and the band bore their last name, so it would have taken an extraordinary level of incompetence or some other egregious offense to get Al kicked out of the band. Frankly, I can't even imagine what this might have been. Two, Al managed to show up and do his job every night, regardless of how much he'd been drinking. Was he a great drummer? That's debatable, but he was certainly a very good drummer. and that he was able to sustain that level of performance while drinking nonstop 7 days a week, nearly every waking hour, is remarkable. People would notice sometimes that Al drank beer throughout every Van Halen performance. It almost became part of the show, Al pouring malt liquor all over himself and his drum kit, and then it sprang and splashing all around him as he flailed away. It looked great and was definitely in keeping with the party atmosphere of a Van Halen concert. And what the? It was just beer, right? Hardly anyone outside of Van Halen's inner circle realized was that this was the soberest part of the day for Alex. Before and after the show, backstage, on the bus, or in the hotel, malt liquor was mixed with hard liquor and the occasional hit of weed or coke. Sometimes the morning after a show, Al would joke about having almost no memory of how he had played or even the crowd's response. And yet, despite performing in a virtual blackout, Al rarely up. Unlike Edward, he wasn't an innovator. He was merely extremely competent. But Al remained competent until the very end, even as his mind and mood began to fray. He was like his father, a fully functional alcoholic. Still, there were some genuinely weird and disturbing moments related to Al's drinking. Like Edward, Al periodically came to my room at night to chat with Jan and me. But whereas Ed was happy to curl up in my lap and tell me how much he loved me, or just complain about David, Al would sometimes appear to be losing touch with reality. "I've been seeing things," he told us one night. "Crazy." "Like what?" I asked. He hesitated, as if he knew that there would be no taking back the information he was about to reveal. "What is it, Al? You can tell me." He nodded. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I see things coming out of the walls." "What kind of things?" I asked. Now he had my attention. "Peckers," Al replied flatly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Big ones. Giant ones." Jan and I looked at each other. Neither one of us laughed, because, appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, there was nothing funny about it. Al wasn't kidding. In the moment, he had seen and believed that there were giant peckers coming out of the wall, and I don't doubt for a minute that this hallucination was frightening. Even more disturbing was the revelation, again, shared late at night in our hotel room, that Al would sometimes go back to his parents' house and climb into bed with them. "I just want to be safe," he'd explain. Was this true? Did it really happen? I have no way of knowing. I can say only that Al told us it happened, and that was enough to make me worry about not only his safety, but the safety of those around him. I would envision Alex at 29 years of age creeping into his parents' bedroom, armed and lying there wide awake, prepared to fend off all types of interlopers, including giant peckers. This was the drummer for one of the biggest bands in the world, a paranoid, delusional alcoholic. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a bit, as it turned out. Here's another story, this one related by my wife, who withheld the details until after I had parted ways with the band. We were bouncing across Canada in April '84. There were 2 big jumps in that portion of the tour, so we flew first class rather than taking our usual fleet of buses. Jane and I were sitting together, with Alex and Edward in the row behind us. As usual, cocktails were served while we sat on the tarmac, and Alex wasted no time in getting started. After we had been in the air for a while, Edward asked Jane if they could switch seats. "I need to talk with Noel about some business," he explained. Jan said, "Sure, no problem." This sort of thing happened all the time, and Jan was forever gracious and accommodating when it came to the demands that Van Halen placed upon my time. Besides, she didn't mind sitting next to Alex. As I said, they would often go shopping or sightseeing together, and despite his descent into alcoholism, Jan genuinely liked Al and found him good company on the road. For whatever reason, they just clicked, and had for as long as they had known each other. So I had no cause for concern when Jan slid into the seat next to Al. For the next couple hours, while Ed and I talked business and music, and he quietly complained about David. Jan and Al chatted behind us. I didn't pay any attention to their conversation, but as Jan reported later, it took an unpleasant turn sometime around Al's 6th or 7th Bloody Mary, when Al began telling dirty jokes. Now, Jan was hardly She was a New York girl, raised in Queens, and could give as good as she got when jousting with the boys. You can't spend the better part of a year on the road with Van Halen and not develop a thick skin about carnal matters. Still, there is a line you don't cross, and Al should have known exactly where that line existed. But if alcohol can make you see giant peckers, then I suppose it can trick you into thinking it's okay to tell disgusting jokes to your manager's wife and then put a sloppy move on her. One joke became 2, and 2 became 4, and Al began slurring the punchlines in a way that Jan found troubling. It wasn't just that Al was drunk and inappropriate, he seemed to be hitting on her. At first, Jan hoped that she was mistaken, but eventually the jokes got dirtier, and Al began to lean into her, and finally out of the blue, he looked Jan in the eye and said, "You know, I would sure like to... you." Okay, let's put the most generous possible spin on this, and presume that Al was too faced to know what he was doing, and simply hit the autopilot switch. The one that told him world-famous rock stars could talk trash to an attractive woman, and it would yield the desired result. Let's presume also that he was so up that he forgot the identity of the person with whom he was flirting. You know, the wife of his band's manager, who just happened to be sitting only a few feet away from him. Even if you give Al the benefit of the doubt on every level, this was stupid and inappropriate behavior. Tough girl that she was, though, Jan tried to defuse a potential catastrophic situation on her own. "Don't be silly, Al. I'm married to your manager," Jan said. "What's wrong with you?" Al's response was a drunken and dismissive wave, followed by, "I don't give a who you're married to." At this point, Jan knew there was no shutting Al down. He was too far gone. She excused herself, returned to my row, and asked Edward if she could have her seat back. "Sure, we're all done here," Edward said politely. He got up, went back to his seat, and Jan sat down next to me. I had no idea that there was anything wrong. No inkling of the exchange that had taken place between my wife and my band's drummer. Looking back on it sometime later, though, I could remember that Jan seemed shaken in some way. She sat down and took my hand in hers. "Everything all right?" I asked. She squeezed my hand tightly. "Yeah, just a little motion sickness. I'll be fine." Nearly a year later, after my tenure with the band had ended, Jan finally told me this story. I was neither surprised nor particularly angry. By then, I had learned to expect the worst from Al. I just felt bad for my wife. Not only had she been badly disrespected, but the perpetrator was someone she considered a friend. Al and Jan had spent quite a lot of time together on that tour, often hanging out backstage before the show. Jan had always considered theirs a strictly platonic relationship. She was married, after all, and to the band's manager. Her friendship with Al seemed safe, but there's no such thing when you're dealing with someone who has not only spent the past 5 years getting laid a couple hundred times a year, but who is also an alcoholic. "I guess it's true what they say about men," Jan said. "They can only be your friend for one reason, and it has nothing to do with friendship." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, although I knew the answer. She laughed. "Because I didn't want my husband getting into a fist fight with one of his band members in the middle of an airplane. I didn't want to be the reason you got fired or Van Halen broke up." "Oh, come on. I wouldn't have done that." Again, Jan laughed. So did I. "You know me well," I said. Well, that's the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2 next week. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.